The blood-red sunset cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Silver Creek, as Abigail Vance's tears stained the forced marriage papers clutched in her trembling hands. The year was 1875, and at 21 years old, she never imagined her father would trade her future for a handful of mining claims and a promise to clear his gambling debts. "You can't make me marry him, Pa." Abigail pleaded, her honey blonde hair falling loose from its pins as she confronted her father in their small clapboard house at the edge of town. "I've never even spoken more than 2 words to Gerald Blackwell. He's 30 years older than me and cruel to everyone." Thomas Vance, once a proud man reduced to a shadow by whiskey and bad luck, couldn't meet his daughter's eyes. "It's done, Abby. The papers are signed. You'll be Mrs. Blackwell come Sunday." "But why? How could you?" Her voice broke as she fought back more tears. "His money will save us both. The ranch is gone, my debts are mounting, and Blackwell owns half the county now. He wants you and I—" Thomas's voice trailed off, shame finally coloring his weathered face. "I had nothing else to offer." Abigail's hands balled into fists. "So you offered me instead, like I'm cattle to be traded." When her father didn't answer, Abigail fled into the fading daylight, papers crushed against her chest, her heart hammering wildly. She had 3 days until the wedding. 3 days to figure a way out of this nightmare, or be bound forever to a man who collected wives like trophies, discarding them when they no longer amused him. The stories about Gerald Blackwell's previous 2 wives haunted Silver Creek. The first allegedly fell down a mine shaft, the second disappeared after going east to visit family and never returned. Now he had set his sights on Abigail, the prettiest girl in the territory according to the whispers at church socials. Abigail ran blindly until she reached the livery stable, her sanctuary since childhood. The familiar smells of hay, leather, and horses enveloped her as she slipped inside. She pressed her back against the rough wooden wall and finally allowed herself to sob openly. "Miss Vance." The deep voice startled her. She hadn't realized anyone was there. Hastily wiping her tears, she looked up to see Hayes Young watching her with concern in his intense blue eyes. Standing over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, Hayes had arrived in Silver Creek 8 months ago. He'd started working as the town's new blacksmith and occasional ranch hand, keeping mostly to himself except when business required otherwise. "I'm sorry," she said, embarrassed at being caught in such a state. "I didn't think anyone was here." Hayes set down the saddle he'd been repairing and approached her cautiously, as if she were a spooked horse. "Are you all right, Miss Vance?" "No," she admitted, too distraught for social niceties. "I'm not all right at all." His eyes flickered to the crumpled papers in her hand. "What's happened?" Something about his gentle concern broke the dam of her composure. Before she could stop herself, Abigail found herself telling this near stranger everything: her father's gambling, the mounting debts, Blackwell's proposition, and the forced marriage that would be her prison sentence. "He's a monster," she concluded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone knows what happened to his other wives." Hayes listened without interruption, his jaw tightening visibly as she spoke. When she finished, he extended his hand, palm up. "May I see those papers?" Hesitantly, Abigail handed them over. Hayes studied them in silence, his expression darkening with each passing moment. Finally, he looked up, and something in his eyes made Abigail's breath catch. "I've crossed paths with men like Blackwell before," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Men who believe money gives them the right to take whatever they want." Before Abigail could respond, Hayes did something that would forever change both their lives. With deliberate slowness, he tore the marriage contract in half, then quarters, then eighths, until the papers were nothing but confetti in his large hands. "He can't have you," Hayes said simply, letting the scraps flutter to the stable floor. "You're not property to be bartered." Abigail stared at him in shock. "Do you know what you've done? Blackwell will come after you, after both of us." Hayes stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes. "Let him come. You're not his. You never will be." His voice softened as he added, "If you need somewhere to go, I have a small cabin outside town. You'd be safe there until we figure something out. The word hung between them, full of questions. I've been watching you since I came to town, Miss Vance. Not in a way that should frighten you, he added quickly. But I've seen how you treat others with kindness, how you read to the children after church, how you helped Mrs. Wilson after her fall last winter. He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. A woman like you deserves to marry for love, not because some rich tyrant decided to add you to his collection. Why would you risk yourself for me? Abigail asked, bewildered by this turn of events. Hayes smiled then, a gentle expression that transformed his usually serious face. Because some things are worth fighting for. For the first time that day, hope flickered in Abigail's heart. But as the stable door crashed open behind them, that hope was quickly extinguished. Gerald Blackwell stood in the doorway, flanked by two of his hired men. His expensive suit and polished boots looked out of place in the humble stable, but the derringer in his hand belonged perfectly in his manicured grip. Well, Blackwell drawled, his thin lips curved in a smile that never reached his cold eyes. What do we have here? My bride to be in the blacksmith, looking quite intimate. His gaze dropped to the torn papers on the ground. And what might those be? Abigail felt Hayes shift slightly, positioning himself between her and Blackwell. The lady doesn't want to marry you, Blackwell, Hayes said evenly. Find yourself another bride. Blackwell laughed, the sound chilling Abigail to her core. That's not how this works, blacksmith. I have a contract with her father. She's mine. She's not yours, Hayes countered, his voice hardening. She's not anyone's to give or take. She's her own woman, free to choose. And I suppose she chooses you, Blackwell sneered. A nobody drifter with dirt under his fingernails and not two coins to rub together. Before Hayes could respond, Blackwell gestured to his men. Take him. Teach him what happens to those who interfere in my business. The two men advanced, but Hayes was ready. Moving with surprising speed for his size, he grabbed a pitchfork leaning against the wall and swung it in a wide arc, forcing the men to jump back. Run, Abigail, he shouted. For a split second, Abigail hesitated, unwilling to leave Hayes alone against three armed men, but when one of Blackwell's men drew his pistol, she knew staying would only make things worse. With a last desperate look at Hayes, she darted past the men and out the stable door. The cool evening air hit her face as she ran, heart pounding. Behind her, she heard shouts and the sounds of a struggle, then a gunshot cracked through the air, freezing her blood. Hayes, she whispered, terror gripping her heart. Before she could decide whether to go back, hoofbeats thundered behind her. Turning, she saw Hayes galloping toward her on a massive black stallion, his face grim but very much alive. He leaned down, extending his arm. Take my hand. Without hesitation, Abigail reached up. Hayes's strong grip closed around her wrist, and with one powerful motion, he swung her up behind him on the horse. Hold tight, he commanded as more gunshots split the air. Abigail wrapped her arms around his waist as the horse leapt forward, carrying them away from Silver Creek and into the gathering darkness. They rode hard for what felt like hours, the horse's powerful strides eating up the distance between them and their pursuers. Abigail clung to Hayes, her face pressed against his back, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat somehow reassuring despite their dire circumstances. Finally, when the moon was high in the night sky, Hayes slowed the horse to a walk and guided it off the main trail into a dense grove of cottonwoods. We should be safe here for a while, he said, dismounting and then helping Abigail down. His hands lingered on her waist a moment longer than necessary, steadying her as her legs trembled from the long ride. Are you hurt? She asked, scanning him for injuries in the silvery moonlight. Hayes shook his head. Nothing serious. Blackwell's aim isn't as good as he thinks it is. He rolled his shoulder with a slight grimace. Bullet just grazed me. Let me see, Abigail insisted, her nursing instincts taking over despite everything else. Reluctantly, Hayes removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeve, revealing a bloody furrow across his upper arm. That needs cleaning, she said, grateful for a practical problem to focus on instead of the terrifying reality of their situation. Is there water nearby? There's a stream just beyond those trees, and I have some supplies in my saddlebag. While Hayes fetched water, Abigail dug through his saddlebag, finding a small medical kit, some jerky, and a flask. She was just unwrapping a clean bandage when he returned. "This will sting," she warned as she poured a small amount of whiskey from his flask onto a cloth. Hayes barely flinched as she cleaned the wound, his eyes never leaving her face as she worked. "You've done this before," he observed. "My mother was a healer before she died. She taught me." Abigail concentrated on bandaging his arm, trying to ignore the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers. "When I was 16, we had a bad influenza season. I helped her tend to half the town. When she finished, their eyes met in the moonlight and something unspoken passed between them." Abigail was suddenly acutely aware of how alone they were, how close he was, and how drastically her life had changed in just a few hours. "Thank you," she said softly, "for what you did back there, for risking your life for me." Hayes gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch feather light. "I meant what I said, Abigail. Some things are worth fighting for." The way he said her name sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cool night air. "You don't even know me," she whispered. "I know enough," he replied. "I know you're brave and kind. I know you deserve better than being sold to a man like Blackwell." He paused, then added quietly, "And I know that since the first day I saw you bringing flowers to old Mrs. Tanner's grave when you thought no one was watching, I haven't been able to get you out of my mind." Abigail's heart fluttered strangely. "Where will we go now? Blackwell won't give up easily." Hayes's expression turned serious again. "I have a friend who owns a ranch about 2 days' ride from here, across the territorial line. We can stay there while we figure out our next move." "Our next move," Abigail repeated, the words both terrifying and exhilarating. In the span of one day, she had gone from a daughter dutifully obeying her father to a woman on the run with a man she barely knew but inexplicably trusted. "Get some rest," Hayes said, spreading his jacket on the ground for her. "We'll leave at first light." Abigail settled onto the makeshift bed, exhaustion suddenly overwhelming her. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Hayes sitting against a tree, his gun across his lap, keeping watch in the moonlight. Dawn broke with golden fingers of light stretching across the eastern sky. Abigail woke to the smell of coffee and the quiet sounds of Hayes preparing a simple breakfast. "You're up early," she said, rising and attempting to smooth the wrinkles from her dress. Hayes handed her a tin cup of steaming coffee. "Old habits. On the trail, you learn to rise with the sun." "Have you been on the trail a lot?" she asked, realizing how little she actually knew about him. Something flickered in his eyes, caution, perhaps, or old pain. "More than I'd like," was all he said. They ate quickly, jerky and hardtack from Hayes's supplies, then mounted the horse again. As they rode, Abigail found herself studying Hayes's profile against the morning sky, wondering about the life he'd led before Silver Creek. "You're not really just a blacksmith, are you?" she finally asked, her arms still wrapped around his waist as they rode. Hayes was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. "No," he finally admitted, "not always." "What were you before?" he sighed, the sound almost lost in the wind. "Many things, a soldier for a while after the war, then a ranger, most recently a bounty hunter." Abigail absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the gentle man who had saved her with the hardened life he described. "Is that why you came to Silver Creek? Were you hunting someone?" Hayes tensed slightly beneath her hands. "Yes, but not in the way you might think." He paused, then continued, his voice low. "I was looking for the man who killed my brother. Did you find him?" "No," the word was clipped final. "The trail went cold in Silver Creek. I took the blacksmith job while I kept searching, but after a few months I started to wonder if maybe it was time to stop chasing ghosts." "I'm sorry about your brother," Abigail said softly. Hayes nodded but said nothing more, and they rode in silence for a time, each lost in their own thoughts. By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly. They stopped to rest the horse beside a small creek, taking shelter in the sparse shade of a mesquite tree. As Abigail splashed cool water on her face, she noticed a cloud of dust on the horizon behind them. "Hayes," she called urgently, pointing. He was beside her in an instant, his expression grim as he squinted at the distant dust. "Riders, at least 3, maybe 4. Blackwell, probably. Hayes quickly gathered their few supplies. We need to move, now. They mounted again, pushing the tired horse harder than before. The terrain grew rougher as they left the flatlands behind, climbing into rolling hills dotted with scrub brush and rocky outcroppings. There's a canyon ahead, Hayes called over his shoulder. If we can reach it before they catch up, we might be able to lose them. The canyon appeared before them, a jagged slash in the earth with steep walls rising on either side. Hayes guided the horse into the narrow entrance, the temperature dropping noticeably as they moved into shadow. "Stay close," he warned as the canyon twisted and branched. "It's easy to get lost in here." They navigated the maze like passages, the only sounds their horses labored breathing and the occasional fall of dislodged rocks. After what seemed like hours, Hayes finally pulled up at a small hidden grotto where a spring bubbled from the canyon wall. "We'll rest here," he decided, helping Abigail dismount. "With luck, they'll take the wrong turn and miss us entirely." Abigail sank gratefully to the ground, her muscles aching from the long ride. What if they don't? What if they find us? Hayes checked his revolver before tucking it back into his holster. "Then I'll deal with them." "I don't want you to kill for me," Abigail said quietly. Hayes looked at her for a long moment. "I've done things I'm not proud of, Abigail, things that haunt me, but protecting you isn't one of them." He knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "I won't let Blackwell or anyone else hurt you, that's a promise." The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "Why do you care so much about me, I mean?" "Because," he said slowly, "in a life that's had too much darkness, you're the first light I've seen in a very long time." Before Abigail could respond, a sound echoed through the canyon, the distant neigh of a horse. Hayes was on his feet instantly, drawing his gun. "Stay here," he whispered, moving toward the entrance to their hiding place. Abigail's heart pounded as she watched him disappear around the bend. Seconds stretched into minutes with agonizing slowness. Then a gunshot cracked through the air, followed by another. Unable to bear the waiting, Abigail grabbed a sharp rock and followed Hayes's path, her makeshift weapon clutched tightly in her trembling hand. As she rounded the corner, she saw Hayes crouched behind a boulder, exchanging fire with two men across the narrow canyon. A third man lay motionless on the ground. One of the men shouted, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Give up, blacksmith. Hand over the girl and maybe Blackwell will let you live." "Not going to happen." Hayes called back, punctuating his refusal with another shot that sent the man diving for cover. Abigail stayed hidden, watching in horror as the firefight continued. When Hayes paused to reload, one of Blackwell's men broke cover, rushing toward his position with a knife drawn. Without thinking, Abigail stepped out and hurled her rock with all her might. The rock struck the man's shoulder, throwing off his aim. He turned toward her with a snarl, but before he could reach her, Hayes tackled him to the ground. They struggled briefly before Hayes gained the upper hand, knocking the man unconscious with a powerful blow. The remaining gunman, seeing his companion fall, fired wildly before retreating around a bend in the canyon. "Abigail?" Hayes was beside her in an instant, checking her for injuries. "I told you to stay hidden." "I couldn't just wait while you fought them alone," she replied, suddenly realizing how close they were, his hands still gripping her shoulders. For a heartbeat, they simply stared at each other, the danger momentarily forgotten. Then Hayes pulled her into a fierce embrace, his arms wrapping protectively around her. "We need to move," he said reluctantly, releasing her. "The last one will bring reinforcements." They returned to their horse and quickly packed their meager supplies. As they prepared to leave, Abigail noticed a dark stain spreading on Hayes's side. "You're hurt," she gasped, reaching toward him. Hayes grimaced. "It's nothing, just a graze." "Let me see," she insisted, lifting his shirt to reveal a bullet wound along his ribs deeper than he claimed. "This is not nothing, it needs stitching." "There's no time," he argued, but the pallor of his face betrayed the pain he was trying to hide. "If we don't treat it now, you could bleed too much to stay in the saddle," Abigail countered firmly. "I need 5 minutes." Recognizing the determination in her voice, Hayes nodded reluctantly. Abigail worked quickly, cleaning the wound as best she could with their limited supplies. then using needle and thread from the small sewing kit in Hayes's saddlebag to close the wound. "You have steady hands," Hayes observed, watching her work despite the pain. "My mother always said healing was as much about courage as knowledge," Abigail replied, tying off the last stitch. "The healer must be brave so the patient can trust them." "I do trust you," Hayes said softly. "More than I've trusted anyone in a long time." Their eyes met, and Abigail felt a warmth bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the desert heat, but the moment was broken by the distant sound of voices echoing through the canyon. "Time to go," Hayes said, rising with a wince. They mounted again, Hayes grimacing as he pulled himself into the saddle, and continued their journey through the twisting canyon passages. By late afternoon, they emerged into open country once more, a vast expanse of rolling hills stretching before them. "We'll make for those hills," Hayes decided, pointing to a line of darker shapes on the horizon. "There's an old trapper's cabin there where we can spend the night." As they rode, Abigail found herself thinking about the extraordinary turn her life had taken. Just yesterday, she had been resigned to a fate worse than death, marriage to a cruel man she despised. Now she was fleeing across the wilderness with a man who had torn up her marriage papers and declared she was no one's property. A man who had taken bullets to protect her freedom. "What are you thinking about?" Hayes asked, noticing her silence. "Everything," she admitted. "How quickly life can change. Yesterday I thought my future was sealed, and now—" She trailed off, uncertain how to describe their current situation. "Now you're free to choose your own path," Hayes finished for her. "Am I?" she asked softly. "Or have I just traded one form of control for another?" Hayes reined the horse to a stop and turned to look at her. "Abigail, the moment we reach safety, if you want to go your own way, I won't stop you. I didn't tear up those papers to claim you for myself. I did it because no one has the right to decide your future but you." The sincerity in his eyes touched something deep within her. "I know," she said. "That's what makes you different from Blackwell, from my father. From any man I've ever known." They reached the trapper's cabin as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. It was a simple one-room structure of rough-hewn logs, but the roof was intact and the stone fireplace promised warmth for the night. While Hayes tended to the horse, Abigail swept years of dust from the cabin floor and gathered wood for a fire. By the time Hayes joined her, she had a small blaze crackling in the fireplace and was inventorying their dwindling supplies. "We have enough food for tomorrow, but we'll need to find more soon," she reported. Hayes nodded, lowering himself carefully onto a bench by the fire, his wound clearly causing him pain. "My friend's ranch is about half a day's ride from here. We should reach it by tomorrow afternoon." Abigail sat beside him, the day's events finally catching up with her. "Will we be safe there?" "Yes, Samuel owes me his life. He'll help us." Hayes stared into the flames, his expression distant. "And he has enough men working for him that Blackwell would be a fool to try anything." "What happens after that?" Abigail asked, the question that had been hovering in her mind all day finally escaping her lips. Hayes turned to her, the firelight casting his features in warm gold. "That depends on what you want, Abigail." "I don't know what I want," she admitted. "I've never been allowed to want anything before." Hayes's hand found hers in the flickering light, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Then maybe that's where you start, by figuring out what Abigail Vance wants, not what someone else wants for her." The tenderness in his voice made her eyes fill with unexpected tears. "I want to not be afraid anymore," she whispered. "I want to make my own choices, even if they're wrong sometimes. I want—" She hesitated, then met his gaze directly. "I want to know why you really tore up those papers." Hayes's thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand, his touch sending shivers up her arm. "Because from the moment I first saw you, I knew you were someone special, someone who deserved better than to be traded like cattle." He paused, his blue eyes searching hers. "And because the thought of you married to another man made something inside me break. You barely knew me," she reminded him softly. "Sometimes you don't need to know everything about a person to know they matter," he replied. "Sometimes you just feel it here." He placed his free hand over his heart. The simple honesty of his words moved her deeply. Before she could overthink it, Abigail leaned forward and pressed her lips gently to his. Hayes remained perfectly still for a heartbeat, then responded with a tenderness that brought fresh tears to her eyes. His hand came up to cup her cheek as the kiss deepened, conveying months of unspoken longing. When they finally parted, Abigail rested her forehead against his. "I've never done that before," she confessed. Hayes smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "I'm honored to be the first." They sat together by the fire for hours, talking as the night deepened around them. Hayes told her about growing up on a small farm in Missouri, about fighting in the war alongside his brother James, and about the fateful day 3 years ago when James was gunned down by a man they trusted. "That's why I became a bounty hunter," he explained. "To find the man who betrayed us." "His name is Nathan Cortland. The same Nathan Cortland who owns the Silver Creek Bank?" Abigail asked in surprise. Hayes's head snapped up. "What did you say, Nathan Cortland? He came to town about 4 months ago and bought the bank from Mr. Simmons. Everyone says he's from back east." Hayes's expression hardened. "What does he look like?" "Tall, with reddish hair and a beard. He walks with a slight limp in his left leg." Abigail watched comprehension dawn on Hayes's face. "It's him, isn't it? The man you've been looking for?" "Yes," Hayes confirmed, his voice tight with suppressed emotion, "and he's been right under my nose this whole time." Abigail placed her hand on his arm. "What will you do?" The question hung between them, laden with implications. Hayes covered her hand with his own. "Once you're safe, I'll deal with Cortland," he said finally. "But not like I planned, not with a gun, with the law." "What changed your mind?" Abigail asked softly, though she thought she knew the answer. Hayes's eyes met hers in the dying firelight. "I found something I want more than revenge. A chance at a different kind of life." The confession, simple yet profound, filled Abigail with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. They talked until exhaustion claimed them both, falling asleep side by side on the cabin's narrow cot, her head resting on his shoulder. Morning came with rosy fingers of light streaming through the cabin's single window. Abigail woke to find Hayes already up, checking his gun at the door. "What is it?" she asked, instantly alert. "Probably nothing," he replied, though his posture remained tense. "Thought I heard something." "Stay here while I check outside." Before she could protest, he slipped out the door. Abigail quickly pulled on her boots and moved to the window, scanning the surrounding area for any sign of danger. Hayes emerged from the trees a few minutes later, his expression grim. "Riders coming. At least 6 of them. Blackwell." Abigail's heart sank. "Most likely, we need to move. Now." They gathered their few belongings and mounted the horse, leaving the shelter of the cabin behind. Hayes pushed the animal hard, galloping across the open country toward a line of hills to the west. "My friend's ranch is just beyond those hills," he called over his shoulder. "If we can reach it, we'll be safe." But their pursuers had fresh horses and were gaining rapidly. Abigail could hear hoofbeats thundering behind them, growing louder with each passing minute. "They're too close," Hayes finally acknowledged, steering their mount toward a rocky outcropping. "We'll make a stand here." He helped Abigail dismount and led her to a position sheltered by large boulders. "Stay down," he instructed, drawing his revolver. "No matter what happens, don't show yourself until I tell you it's safe." "Hayes, I can't just hide while you..." "Please, Abigail." His eyes held hers, intense and pleading. "I can't focus on fighting them if I'm worried about you." Reluctantly, she nodded, crouching behind the rocks as Hayes positioned himself to meet the oncoming riders. The first shot came moments later, a rifle report that echoed across the hills. Hayes returned fire, his revolver barking sharply in the morning air. Abigail huddled behind her rock, hands pressed over her ears as the gunfight intensified. Through gaps in the boulders, she could see 5 men spread out in a semicircle, trying to flank Hayes's position. One fell as Hayes's bullet found its mark, but the others continued their advance, lead whistling through the air around them. Then, above the gunfire, came a sound that froze her blood, Hayes's grunt of pain as a bullet struck home. She peered through the rocks to see him slumped against a boulder, his left arm hanging useless at his side, blood darkening his shirt. Despite his injury, Hayes continued firing, dropping another of Blackwell's men. But he was outnumbered and wounded, and Abigail knew with sickening certainty that he couldn't hold them off much longer. Making a split-second decision, she searched the ground around her, finding a pistol that Hayes had left within her reach. Gripping it with trembling hands, she took a deep breath and rose from her hiding place. "Stop," she shouted, aiming the gun at the nearest attacker. "The next one who fires dies." The unexpected appearance of a second defender momentarily confused the gunmen. In that instant of hesitation, the air was filled with the thunder of fresh hoofbeats as a dozen mounted riders crested the hill behind them. "Drop your weapons," commanded the lead rider, a tall man with a silver star pinned to his vest. "U.S. Marshal, drop them now." Blackwell's remaining men, finding themselves suddenly outgunned and surrounded, slowly lowered their weapons. "Hayes!" Abigail rushed to his side, her heart pounding with fear at the amount of blood staining his shirt. "I told you to stay hidden," he muttered, though a faint smile touched his lips. "And I told you I'm tired of letting others make my choices," she retorted, pressing her handkerchief against his wound. The marshal dismounted and approached them, concern etched on his weathered face. "Hayes Young. Seems I can't leave you alone for 5 minutes without you getting yourself shot." "Samuel," Hayes acknowledged weakly, "your timing could be better." "Seems perfect from where I'm standing," the marshal replied dryly, then turned to Abigail. "Madam, I'm U.S. Marshal Samuel Cooper. This stubborn fool is an old friend of mine." "Abigail Vance," she introduced herself, not taking her eyes off Hayes's pale face. "He needs a doctor." "My ranch is just over that rise," Samuel assured her. "We have a good doctor there. My men will take care of these outlaws." He gestured to Blackwell's captured men. "Now, can one of you tell me what in tarnation is going on?" As Hayes was carefully loaded into a wagon, Abigail explained everything: her forced marriage, Hayes's intervention, their flight from Silver Creek, and the revelation about Nathan Cortland's true identity. "Cortland, you say?" Samuel's expression hardened. "We've been after him for years. Bank robbery, murder, fraud across 3 territories. He killed my brother," Hayes added weakly from the wagon. "And now we've got him," Samuel assured him. "I'll send men to Silver Creek today. He won't escape justice this time." "What about Blackwell?" Abigail asked, her voice trembling slightly at the name. "Gerald Blackwell has a warrant out in Colorado territory for the murder of his second wife," Samuel informed her grimly. "Once we have him in custody, he'll hang." Relief washed over Abigail like a cool rain after drought. "So it's over." "We're safe." "Yes, Miss Vance," Samuel confirmed. "You're safe now." The journey to Samuel's ranch passed in a blur of anxiety for Abigail, her attention focused entirely on Hayes's condition. By the time they arrived at the sprawling ranch house, his face was ashen from blood loss, his breathing shallow. The ranch doctor, a former Army surgeon named Dr. Phillips, immediately took charge, ordering Hayes carried to a bedroom where he could properly treat the wound. "The bullet's still in there," he informed Abigail after his examination. "I need to remove it before infection sets in." "Will he be all right?" she asked, clutching Hayes's limp hand. Dr. Phillips's kind eyes met hers. "He's strong, and the bullet missed anything vital. With proper care and rest, he should recover fully." Abigail refused to leave Hayes's side during the surgery, assisting the doctor by holding instruments and keeping the patient as comfortable as possible. When the bullet was finally extracted and the wound cleaned and dressed, Dr. Phillips stepped back with a satisfied nod. "You've got steady hands, Miss Vance. Ever consider nursing?" "My mother was a healer," she replied, gently wiping Hayes's brow with a cool cloth. "She taught me what she knew." "Well, your young man is fortunate to have you," the doctor observed before leaving them alone. Abigail blushed at the phrase, "your young man," but didn't correct him. Instead, she settled into a chair beside the bed, prepared to maintain her vigil for as long as necessary. Hours passed. Outside the window, the sun tracked its path across the sky, shadows lengthening as afternoon faded toward evening. Samuel visited briefly, informing her that a telegram had been sent to Silver Creek and that deputies were already on their way to arrest Nathan Cortland. "What about my father?" Abigail asked quietly. Samuel's expression softened. Your father made a mistake, Miss Vance, but forcing his daughter into marriage isn't a crime by itself. However, if he knowingly aided Blackwell, who is wanted for murder. He didn't know, Abigail said with certainty. My father is weak and foolish, but not evil. He wouldn't have sent me to Blackwell if he'd known about the wives. Then he has nothing to fear from the law, Samuel assured her, though he may have plenty to fear from you when you return. If I return, Abigail murmured, her eyes drifting back to Hayes's sleeping form. Samuel followed her gaze, a knowing smile touching his lips. I've known Hayes Young for 15 years, Miss Vance, fought alongside him in the war, tracked outlaws with him after. In all that time, I've never seen him risk everything for anyone the way he did for you. He paused, then added gently, that kind of devotion is rare. After Samuel left, Abigail pondered his words, her heart full of emotions she was only beginning to understand. As twilight deepened into night, she continued her watch, dozing occasionally but never leaving Hayes's side. It was nearly midnight when Hayes finally stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. For a moment, he seemed disoriented, his gaze darting around the unfamiliar room until it settled on Abigail. You're still here, he whispered, his voice rough with sleep and pain. Abigail leaned forward, taking his hand in hers. Where else would I be? A smile touched his lips. Anywhere. You're free now, Abigail. Blackwell can't hurt you anymore. I know, she said softly. But freedom means choosing where I want to be, and right now, that's here with you. Hayes's fingers tightened around hers. You deserve better than a former bounty hunter with nothing to offer but a tarnished reputation and a bullet-riddled body. That's not who you are, Abigail countered firmly. You're the man who tore up my marriage papers and said I wasn't property to be bartered. You're the man who risked his life to protect my freedom to choose. She leaned closer, her free hand gently touching his cheek. And I choose you, Hayes Young, if you'll have me. The vulnerability in her voice seemed to reach something deep within him. Hayes lifted his hand, despite the pain the movement clearly caused, and traced the curve of her cheek with trembling fingers. I've wanted you since the first moment I saw you, he admitted hoarsely. But I never thought, never dared hope. Words failing him, Hayes drew her down to him, his lips finding hers in a kiss that spoke more eloquently than any declaration. When they finally parted, Abigail rested her forehead against his, her heart fuller than she had ever thought possible. Rest now, she murmured. We have time, all the time in the world. Hayes's recovery progressed steadily over the next 2 weeks. Each day found him stronger, able to stay awake longer and eventually to leave his bed for short periods. Throughout his convalescence, Abigail remained by his side, reading to him, changing his bandages, and simply talking, learning each other's histories, dreams, and secrets. News arrived from Silver Creek. Nathan Cortland had been arrested without incident, found cowering in the bank vault he'd once owned. Gerald Blackwell, however, had fled before the law could reach him, disappearing into the vast western territories with a price now on his head. He'll be caught eventually, Samuel assured them when he brought the news. Men like Blackwell always make mistakes. A letter came from Abigail's father as well, carried by one of Samuel's men who had business in Silver Creek. Thomas Vance's shaky handwriting filled 4 pages with apologies and regrets, begging his daughter's forgiveness for his terrible mistake. He was trying to protect you in his own misguided way, Hayes observed as Abigail read the letter aloud to him. I know, she sighed. But protection without respect isn't love, it's control. What will you tell him? Abigail considered the question carefully. That I forgive him, but I won't be returning to Silver Creek, not to live under his roof again. Where will you go? Hayes asked, his voice carefully neutral despite the intensity in his eyes. Setting aside the letter, Abigail took his hand. That depends on you, Hayes Young, on what you want your future to be. Hayes pulled her gently toward him until she was seated on the edge of his bed. I was thinking about that, about the future. His thumb traced patterns on her palm as he spoke. Samuel offered me a position as his deputy, said with Cortland captured, it's time I stopped drifting and put down roots. Is that what you want? Abigail asked, her heart quickening. Part of it, Hayes replied. The job would mean a steady income, a small house in town. He met her eyes directly. But a house isn't a home without someone to share it with, understanding dawned in Abigail's eyes. Are you asking what I think you're asking, Hayes Young? A smile spread across his face, transforming his features in that way that never failed to make her breath catch. I'm asking if you'd consider making a life with me, Abigail Vance, not because someone forced you into it, but because you choose it freely. Joy bubbled up within her like a spring. Is this a proper proposal, sir? Not yet, Hayes admitted with a chuckle. When I propose properly, I intend to be on one knee, not flat on my back in a sict, but I wanted you to know my intentions are honorable and my heart is entirely yours. Abigail leaned forward to kiss him, a kiss full of promise and possibility. Then I will wait for that proper proposal, Mr. Young, but in the meantime, yes, I would very much like to make a life with you. By the time autumn painted the hills in gold and crimson, Hayes was fully recovered and settled into his new role as Deputy U.S. Marshal. True to his word, he had purchased a small house on the outskirts of Willow Springs, the town nearest to Samuel's ranch. It was a modest dwelling, but solidly built, with a wide porch and enough land for a garden and a few horses. On a crisp October evening, Hayes took Abigail for a ride to a bluff overlooking the valley, the setting sun casting long shadows across the landscape below. There, with the vast western sky stretching endlessly above them, he finally dropped to one knee and offered her a simple gold ring that had belonged to his mother. Abigail Vance, he said, his voice steady despite the nervous light in his eyes. From the moment I tore up those marriage papers, I knew my heart was yours. Will you marry me, not because anyone forces you, but because you choose to? Tears of happiness blurring her vision, Abigail nodded. Yes, she whispered. 1,000 times yes. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the town church, with Samuel standing as Hayes's best man and Mrs. Cooper, the marshal's wife, serving as Abigail's matron of honor. Thomas Vance did not attend. His reply to Abigail's invitation had been a brief note explaining that he had sold what remained of their property in Silver Creek and headed to California to make a fresh start. He enclosed this, Abigail told Hayes the night before their wedding, showing him a bank draft for a considerable sum. Said it was my mother's inheritance that he'd been holding, that it's mine by right. Hayes whistled softly at the amount. That's enough to buy a proper ranch of our own someday, if that's what you want. What I want, Abigail replied, nestling against him on the porch swing of their new home, is a future we build together, whatever shape that takes. The following spring brought news that Nathan Cortland had been tried and convicted for the murder of James Young, along with numerous other crimes. He would hang within the month, finally bringing closure to the quest that had driven Hayes for so long. Do you feel different? Abigail asked when Hayes returned from witnessing the execution. Now that it's done, Hayes considered the question as they sat together on their porch, watching the sunset. I thought I would, he admitted. I spent so many years consumed by the need for justice that I wasn't sure who I'd be without it. He took her hand, his thumb brushing over the gold band on her finger. But it turns out I'm still just Hayes Young, your husband, and that's enough. More than enough, Abigail assured him, leaning against his shoulder. As twilight deepened around them, Hayes pulled a folded paper from his pocket, yellow with age and worn at the creases from being unfolded and refolded many times. What's that? Abigail asked. The marriage contract, Hayes replied, holding it up in the fading light. The one I tore up that day in the stable. I kept the pieces. Abigail looked at him in surprise. Why? To remind myself that some things are worth fighting for. That some promises should be broken so better ones can be made. He squeezed her hand gently. And because the day I tore this up was the day my life truly began. Together they watched as Hayes struck a match and held it to the corner of the tattered document. The paper caught quickly, flames consuming the contract that had once threatened to bind Abigail to a fate she hadn't chosen. When nothing remained but ashes, Hayes scattered them into the evening breeze. There, he said softly. Now the only promises between us are the ones we've chosen freely. Abigail leaned up to kiss him, her heart full to bursting with love for this man who had given her the greatest gift of all, the freedom to choose her own destiny and the joy of choosing him. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Hayes drew her close, his voice a tender whisper against her hair. "You're mine forever, Abigail Young, not because any paper says so, but because we both want it that way." "Forever," she agreed, knowing with absolute certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be, in the arms of the man who had torn up her forced marriage papers, and in doing so, given her a love more precious than freedom itself. Years passed, turning like pages in the story of their life together. Their small house expanded as their family grew, first with the arrival of James Thomas Young, named for Hayes's brother and Abigail's father, and 2 years later with Emma Rose, whose honey blonde curls and determined spirit were mirror images of her mother's. With the money from Abigail's inheritance and Hayes's earnings as a deputy marshal, they eventually purchased land of their own, a sprawling ranch they named Freedom's Claim, where horses roamed across verdant pastures and children's laughter echoed against distant hills. Gerald Blackwell never returned to haunt them. Word eventually reached Willow Springs that he had been killed in a gambling dispute in some nameless border town, dying as he had lived alone and unmourned. Thomas Vance wrote occasionally from California, where he had found work as a clerk in a shipping company. His letters spoke of regret and redemption, of lessons learned too late but cherished nonetheless. When James was 5, Thomas made the journey east to meet his grandchildren, arriving with a carved wooden horse for the boy and a porcelain doll for Emma. The visit was awkward at first, but healing came in small moments, Thomas teaching James to whittle, Abigail showing her father the garden she had planted, Hayes and Thomas sharing quiet conversations on the porch as daylight faded. "Thank you," Thomas said to Hayes on his last evening before departing, "for giving my daughter what I couldn't, the freedom to find her own happiness." Hayes simply nodded, the old animosity long since replaced by understanding. She found it herself. "I just tore up the papers that stood in her way." As the children grew, so did the legend of how their parents had met, the story of the forced marriage papers and the cowboy who had declared, "She's mine forever." It became a family tale, embellished with each telling until it took on the quality of myth. "Tell us again, Papa," 8-year-old Emma would beg, her blue eyes so like her father's, wide with anticipation. "Tell us how you rescued Mama." And Hayes would gather his children close, catching Abigail's smile across the room as he began. "Once upon a time, there was a brave and beautiful woman who was being forced to marry a man she didn't love." The children never tired of hearing how their father had torn the marriage papers to pieces, how he had been shot protecting their mother, and how they had fallen in love while fleeing across the wilderness. It was, to their young minds, the most romantic story ever told. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Hayes surprised Abigail with a special gift, a locket containing a tiny fragment of the original marriage contract, preserved between 2 pieces of glass. "To remember where we started," he explained as she opened it, "and how far we've come." Abigail touched the yellowed scrap of paper through the glass, marveling at how something that had once represented her imprisonment now symbolized her liberation. "I never dreamed, that day in the stable, that tearing up those papers would lead to all of this." Hayes drew her into his arms, his love for her undiminished by the passing years. "I knew," he said simply. "The moment I saw you crying over those papers, I knew you were meant to be free, and I hoped with everything in me that you might choose to share that freedom with me." "Best decision I ever made," Abigail murmured against his chest. As twilight settled over their land, they stood together on the porch of the home they had built, watching their children race across the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. James, now a lanky teenager with his father's quiet strength, chased after Emma, who at 10 had already developed her mother's determination and spirit. "We did well, didn't we?" Hayes said softly, his arm around Abigail's waist. "We did," she agreed, leaning into his embrace. Though sometimes I still can't believe how it all began with forced marriage papers and a stubborn cowboy who refused to let me be bartered away. Hayes pressed a kiss to her temple. I'd tear up 1,000 contracts for you, Abigail Young. And I'd choose you 1,000 times over, she replied, turning in his arms to meet his lips with hers. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they remained on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms, two people who had found in each other not possession, but partnership, not control, but freedom, not a forced union, but a love freely chosen, again and again with each passing day. And in the vast tapestry of the American West, with all its legends of gunfighters and gold seekers, perhaps no story was more enduring than that of the cowboy who tore up a forced marriage contract and declared a woman free to choose her own destiny, and the woman brave enough to choose him in return.